Jesus is perhaps the most popular religious figure around the world, and with that level of popularity, there are bound to be some misconceptions and just some plain lies about Jesus. In this video, I'll be sharing 10 of the biggest lies about Jesus that you need to know. Welcome back to Moz TV. Guys, I want you to stick around till the end of this video just to see how many of these lies that you actually knew. Okay, let's start with the lie number 10. And this lie is that Jesus wrote the New Testament. When it comes to the Bible in general, archaeology and the study of written sources have shed some light on the history of both halves of the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament contains a story of the children of Israel among other things before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus onward. However, although the New Testament is filled with many teachings of Jesus, Jesus in fact didn't write any portion of the New Testament, nor did he write any of the Old Testament for that matter. Of course, he couldn't because he wasn't even born yet. Traditionally, 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament of the Bible were attributed to the Apostle Paul, who famously converted to Christianity after meeting Jesus in a vision on the road to Damascus, and he wrote a series of letters that helped spread the faith. Although the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that begin in the New Testament of the Bible are believed to be eyewitness testimony as well as the words and the teachings. The birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus are listed in their books. But no, Jesus did not personally write any portion of the New Testament. Lie number 9. Jesus was white. This is the most common image of Jesus that's been seen around the world. You know, he's light-skinned with a beard, he has long hairs, and often he's depicted with blue eyes. But in fact, Jesus was a Palestinian Jewish man living in Galilee in the 1st century. Forensic scientists have done facial reconstruction of 2,000 years old skulls from Palestine in order to get a sense of what Jesus might have looked like. With olive skin, black hair, and larger, not so pointed nose he's normally depicted with. Lie at number 8 is that Muslims don't believe in Jesus. Of course, Jesus is the central figure of the Christianity, so he's often just associated with that faith. However, the Quran, the Muslims' holy book, mentions Jesus many times as an important holy figure, while he is not believed to be divine or referred to as the Son of God in any way. He is, however, commonly acknowledged and considered to be a mighty messenger of God in the Islamic faith. Also, the Quran contains a surah in it titled Surah Maryam, and it contains many instances throughout the life of Jesus. The next lie may come as a shock. Jesus is Christian. Well, in fact, Jesus was a Jew born in Galilee in a Jewish part of the world. All of his friends, close associates, all of them they were Jews. He regularly worshiped in Jewish communal worship as well, but a Christian is a follower of Christ. So Jesus himself is the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. So it wouldn't make sense to follow himself. Apart from that though, the term Christian only appeared well into the book of Acts of New Testament, Acts chapter 11, when they were given that name by other people. But before that though, the followers of Jesus were just called something like the followers of the way, or they were just believed to be a Jewish sect that would follow Jesus. The next lie is kind of funny, but Jesus was called Jesus. That is a lie. As we mentioned earlier, Jesus was Jewish by birth and by religion, and therefore it makes sense that he would have a Hebrew name. That's the language of Jews, but the name Jesus isn't a Hebrew name, so we have a problem there. Well, this is mainly to do with the language. The name Jesus is simply a derivative of Greek translation of his real name. His Greek-speaking apostles were probably unable to pronounce his Hebrew name, which was Yahushua, also pronounced as Yeshua, but when the name is translated into English, it becomes Joshua. So interestingly, the Quran refers to Jesus as Isa. So Jesus, Yahushua, Yeshua, Joshua, Isa, all of them the exact same name. At lie number 5, Jesus had 12 disciples. In fact, no, he did not. The belief that Jesus only had 12 disciples is based on the misunderstanding of the three categories of Jesus' followers. First was made up of those who came to hear him speak or to be healed by him whenever he entered a town or village. And the second category, you can label these people as those who followed Jesus from town to town, and these were called disciples according to the Gospel of Luke. Those were about 70 or 72 of them in total. Also, there is the third category of the followers of Jesus. Now, these are known as the apostles. These are the 12 men that Jesus appointed to go off on their own and preach his message independently without Jesus' supervision. So these weren't just mere disciples because they didn't just follow the teachings of Jesus, but they also went to share the message, start new churches in different parts of the world. Also, in the books of the Acts of New Testament, it's mentioned that about 120 of Jesus' disciples were gathered in an upper room. One common lie is that Jesus only taught as an adult. Jesus was a preacher as an adolescent as well. The Bible describes a time when Jesus was 12 years old and he was founded by his parents preaching in the temple to adults. And according to the Bible, this is what it has to say. Finally, after 3 days, they found him in a temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. So not only at 12 years old was Jesus asking questions to other religious leaders, but he was also teaching them and giving them answers according to the text. Also, according to Islamic teachings, we find in the Quran the following verse about Jesus talking while he was in the cradle as a baby. Jesus said, "Indeed, I am the servant of Allah. He has given me a scripture and made me a prophet." Lie number 3. 3 wise men. Did you know that there weren't 3 wise men? It's a common scene depicted in the nativity scenes, especially around Christmas time, but it does report that some wise men came to Jesus when he was born, but it doesn't say how many, contrary to the common belief that there were 3 of them. None of the early church fathers suggested that these wise men or magi were kings either. The term magi used in the Bible is plural. There are apparently at least 2 of them, but there could have been several. More Bible simply mentions 3 gifts that were presented to baby Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We also know from the Bible that Jesus was not a little newborn when they arrived after the Magi visited Mary. Lie at number 2 is Jesus was an only child. Jesus was actually the firstborn, not an only child of Mary. According to the Bible, in the book of Matthew chapter 13 verse 55 to 56 says, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name is Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us as well? Where then this man gets all these things?" And the lie number 1, Jesus' birthday. Well, the Bible does not specify a day or month that Jesus was born, but one problem is that a lot of people believe that the birthday was December 25th, but the Bible doesn't indicate that either. An issue does come with the dating the birthday in December, though, is that it would be very unusual for shepherds to be in the fields at this cold time of the year, when the fields were unproductive, and normally the practice was to keep the flocks in the field from the spring to the autumn. Also, winter would likely be an especially difficult time for pregnant Mary to travel long distances, Nazareth to the town of Bethlehem, which is about 70 miles. And it actually wasn't until the year 440 AD that the church officially associated December 25th with the birth of Jesus. Also, according to the Islamic belief, the Quran mentions in Surah 19 verse 25 Jesus talking to his mother Mary, and it says, "And shake toward you the trunk of the palm tree, it will drop upon you ripe, fresh dates." Typically, palm trees begins to bear fruit in April or May and are ripe for picking around August to September. So yes, when we look at the biblical accounts and the Quranic accounts, it just wouldn't necessarily make sense for Jesus to be born on December 25th. And the common belief was that he was born sometime in the fall, maybe even in early spring. Alright guys, these were the 10 biggest lies about Jesus. Let us know in the comment section which of these lies did you know about. Also share your thoughts about this video. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to like it and share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to be notified when the new videos are posted. Until next time, peace.